For better or worse, combat is one of the things that almost every tabletop role-playing game has an abstract subsystem for. For many games, the overall process remains the same. Figure out turn order and take turns rolling to see who is able to thump the other senseless. You know, rules to mitigate the possibility of the game devolving into a tired argument of, I got you, no you didn't, yes I did. While in all honesty, the best way to resolve combat in Shadowrun is to avoid it at all costs. But you know there's going to be some knucklehead that inevitably thinks, it can't be all that bad. But allow me to assure you, it is. Anyway, we're going to be taking a look today at Shadowrun 4th Edition's combat subsystem. First and foremost, combat in any edition of Shadowrun can be a slog. There's a lot of rolls to be made, and lots of dice involved, and it is a very complicated process. The simple rundown is this. As is often the case, you start by determining initiative order. The initiative roll in Shadowrun 4e is based off your character's initiative score, their reaction added to their intuition. You roll up that many dice, count up the hits, and add the number of hits to your score. Highest number goes first. On your turn, you start your action phase. You get one complex action, or two simple actions. In addition, you also get one free action. When you've completed your actions, it moves on to the next character. When everybody has acted, you then check if anybody has any extra initiative passes. These are usually granted by either spells or cyberware. Anybody who has an additional initiative pass gets another action phase on their same initiative turn. Once everybody has used up all their initiative passes, you start again with having everybody roll for initiative. Starting again at initiative does make a difference, since wound penalties from either of your condition monitors will lower your initiative, which affects your score and how many dice you roll. Almost all combat actions are resolved in the same way, be they in meat space, astral space, or cyberspace. The attacker declares who and what they're targeting, and if they can, the defender declares what they will be doing in response. For the most part, how you defend needs to make sense. Under normal circumstances, you cannot block bullets with a sword or catch them out of the air with your hand. In fact, in ranged combat, typically all you get is your reaction attribute. Meanwhile, if you're in a melee fight with them, you can use dodge, unarmed, or a weapon skill, assuming you have a suitable weapon equipped. Both sides form their dice pools, apply relevant modifiers depending on the situation at hand, and let me assure you there is a lot of modifiers. Melee attacks have one on page 157, and range attacks have one on page 159. Whomever rolls more hits succeeds in their action. The attacker manages to hit their target, or the defender avoids harm altogether. In fact, if the defender is successful, you can usually stop right there and move on to the next action. On a tie, this is a grazing hit. It doesn't do damage, but contact is made, and you can still use things like poison, shot gloves, touch spells, or anything else where you just need to touch the target as opposed to getting a solid blow. On the attacker's success is where things get a little complicated. You add the net hits, however many more the attacker got than the defender, to the damage value of their weapon. This gives you the modified damage value. Then, you apply any armor penetration from their weapon to the defender's armor value. This gives modified armor value. You compare modified damage and modified armor values. If it's a physical attack and the modified armor value is greater than the modified damage, then the attack will do stun damage instead of physical. After that, you make a damage resistance roll, which is the relevant attribute and the modified armor value. Each hit made on this roll reduces the damage by 1. In most cases, body will be the relevant attribute, but some spells might resist with willpower instead. And once you have the final amount of damage dealt, you apply it to the relevant condition monitor. And that's how most combat actions, the ones meant for hurting people, are resolved. This is a lot to go through step by step, but if you do it a few times, it'll eventually click and become autonomous. The things you should definitely keep in mind are this though. Normal attacks are often made with agility and the relevant skill. Ranged or melee, it's going to be agility and the skill for how you're fighting. Normal defending is almost always going to be reaction and maybe a relevant skill. Magic and cyber combat will no doubt be wacky and have their own combinations of stats and skills. And while there is a lot of modifiers and ways that certain actions can tweak either side of the attacker's or defender's formula, this just means you have a lot of tactical options. And even if your character is just somebody meant to fight, consider this. Sun Tzu wrote in The Art of War, "If you know the enemy and know yourself, you need not fear the result of even 100 battles. If you know yourself, but not the enemy, for every victory gained, you will also suffer a defeat. If you know neither the enemy nor yourself, you will succumb in every battle. If you're just somebody meant to fight, knowing who you could possibly be fighting is just as important as how the sneaky guy is going to break in. Because if the sneaky guy blows it, that'll be your time to shine. And if you were a dreckhead that decided armor-piercing rounds were for wusses, you're going to look really silly trying to take down a Renraku Red Samurai with your standard soft points. The point I'm getting at is that, as a street samurai, some of the legwork you can do is figuring out who has the defense contract on the place you're trying to break into, and further, what that person's standard kit is going to look like. If they have a crisis response team that rolls in with heavy armor, spend some extra money to get some bullets that'll punch through that. But if the target is cheap and uses in-house rent-a-cops that couldn't even cut getting into Lone Star, and they don't even have anything more than a starched polo shirt, a baseball cap, and a taser, bring stun rounds. There's no need to make things bloody. Speaking of tactics, let's talk about some of those modifiers and what you can do to tip things in your favor. First and foremost, if you're dealing with a big target or otherwise need to start taking people out quick, gang up on one person. For each defense roll after the first, you take a -1 penalty to your defenses. A single punch is easy to dodge. Several punches from all sorts of different directions? That's where things get a little trickier. And speaking of ganging up, if you're in melee combat, you also get a +1 die for every ally in the fray with you. Though if it's a right and true brawl where a bunch of dudes are taking sides and thumping each other upside the head, this bonus only applies to the side that has more dudes and only by how many more dudes they have over their enemy. Meaning, in a fight between 5 boneheads and 3 duendes, the boneheads are all going to get a +2 to their attacks. Meaning the duendes should focus on their attacks on one bonehead if they can and try to take them out of the fight as soon as possible if they hope to even the playing field. They might also stand a better chance with some weapons that have slightly better reach. Bring a club to a fist fight, or a long and pointy stick to a club fight. Most of your tactical considerations will stem from guns though, because ranged combat has a long list of modifiers, and most of them are negative. See the chart on page 152. As I mentioned earlier, you only get your dice from your reaction attribute to defend against ranged attacks, which means the easiest way to protect against guns is to be aware of the situation and impose those penalties on somebody that's going to be firing at you. Meanwhile, attackers in ranged combat have the properties of their gun and other weapons to consider. Single-shot weapons can generally only be fired once per round, despite calling for a simple action. Once you shoot your shot, you're empty. You need to take an action to reload. To fire more than once as a simple action, you want a semiotic, burst, or automatic weapon. Burst fire and automatic is where things get a little wild. First, you need to decide if your shot is going to be wide or narrow burst. Narrow bursts will deal more damage, but wide bursts will lower the defender's dice pool. The drawback to any sort of burst or any instance where you go Frank Reynolds on somebody and start blasting is that every extra round fired gives a recoil penalty, which is not that bad of a trade-off since targets will only get their reaction or they'll lose their turn aborting into a full dodge. And if you got the spare Nuyen, you can always get recoil compensation on your gun if you don't have it already. My personal favorite option has to be suppressive fire though. It requires a full auto weapon and it burns through 20 rounds, but it'll turn a 10-meter wide cone into a kill zone. You roll your agility and the weapon skill and you make note of the hits. Anyone who is not prone, protected by cover, or moves into that area, then has to make a reaction plus edge test with a threshold equal to the amount of hits that you scored. Failure means that they take damage equal to the base value of your weapon. It's very wasteful, but it is very satisfying. And last, never underestimate the power of a good set of body armor, worn by you or an adversary. It can possibly reduce physical damage to stun, especially if your armor rating is high enough. And if you find yourself up against somebody with armor, and you forgot your armor-piercing rounds, don't worry, you still have options. Specifically, called shots. And called shots are a little bit more abstract in Shadowrun 4th edition. You don't necessarily say, I want to aim for this part of their body, what now? Instead, you picked one of 3 effects that you're aiming for. Ha! And then that determines how your roll is modified. If you want to ignore armor, you get a penalty to your dice roll equal to their armor rating, but you do ignore the armor when it comes time for them to resist damage. You could also opt for aiming for a vital spot. You can take a 1 to 4 penalty to your attack roll, but you gain that much more damage if it connects. And last, disarm. You'll be at a -4 penalty for that, but if the modified damage exceeds the strength of the target, they'll drop anything that they're holding. These are very good options if you're super accurate with your gun, but you left your hand cannon at home and you're left with just a pea shooter. The best part of all this, though, in my opinion, is that these are all options that are available out of the starting gate. You don't need some special positive quality to use them. The penalty you suffer is cost enough. There's a lot of fiddly bits and moving parts for combat in Shadowrun, and it works both to its advantage and disadvantage. The downside is, of course, that so many options and variables means it takes a lot of mental resources to keep track of everything. Make some cheat sheets, that should help, as will pre-calculating a lot of the dice pools you'll be expecting to need for certain situations. It's the sort of thing that'll help you brush up on some of your basic algebra, really. The flip side, though, is that many of these options are available right at the onset. You don't need some special quality or ability to be able to use them. So if you really want to, you can be a wizard that also happens to be really good at using regular-ass guns, and it'll give you plenty of options on its own just by having a strong firearms or pistol skill. It's useful if you already got all the spells and other features you want as a mage, and feel like you should avoid being a one-trick pony. Compare this to the contemporary of Shadowrun Anniversary Edition, Dungeons & Dragons 3.5. Most of the special tricks you would want to pull off with ranged weapons or the like would be something you would need to spend a feat to get. A couple of feats to get, on top of having to deal with any downsides that would be imposed for taking that action, assuming it's even worth doing that action in the first place. You still have a lot of challenges and bookkeeping that comes up with combat in Shadowrun, but I'll illustrate just how bad that can get later. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this or found it helpful, give me a thumbs up like. And if you want to know more about Shadowrun or other rules-dense tabletop role-playing games, check out some of my other videos, or consider subscribing. With all that said, shoot straight, conserve ammo, and never cut a deal with a dragon.